Hello, I'm Dorothy Dowling, and welcome to It's Personal Stories, a hospitality podcast focused on the journeys, lessons, and lived experiences of leaders across our industry. We're a nonprofit platform committed to empowering personal success through storytelling and shared wisdom. Today, I am honored to welcome John Paul Nichols, CEO of Club Quarters. John Paul, thank you for joining us. It's truly a privilege to have you with us today.
My pleasure. So, as you know, we worked together many years ago, and it's just great to do this as a follow-up.
Thank you. Thank you, John Paul. I feel the same way. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about your career trajectory because your career has touched brand development, business growth, and real estate value creation. I'm wondering if you can walk us through your professional journey and share how intentional your career mapping or purposeful decisions help shape the path you've taken.
Sure, and I'll try to keep it short. As you know, career. I've been doing this for a while now, so about 40 years. So there's a little bit of a story there, but I'll say some of it was opportunistic, and some of it was planned. And needless to say, as I aged in my career, it became more and more planned. But as many of us in the hotel business, I started as a bellman, literally as a bellman one day at a Hilton in Longboat Key in Florida. And it just became the career that I enjoyed, very people-oriented. So that was the first, what I'll call exposure to it. And that's after going to college for a traditional liberal arts degree with a little bit of business focus. So it certainly wasn't a hospitality focus. But what attracted me to the industry broadly was the way I grew up. I grew up internationally most of my life. From Wisconsin, but I grew up in Brazil and in Chile and in Spain. And I wanted a career that would eventually allow me that similar kind of exposure or being able to leverage some of that background from a very early age as I get into an older career. Now, to get there, I took a lot of lefts and I took a lot of rights. So I literally started with Howard Johnson's back when Howard Johnson owned Howard Johnson's and ran Howard Johnson's. That may date me a little bit, but in Florida, so to speak. But then I left, frankly, and this is where it became opportunistic, to effectively run an Indian reservation in Southern California and get into Indian gambling. We happened to be the case that won the Supreme Court case. The Seminoles and the Seminoles of Florida, we in California, the Cabazons, for whatever reason, the Supreme Court decided to hear the Cabazon decision or the Cabazon case. And that's why Indian gaming is established the way it is. Did that for about 10 years. And as you might imagine, broadly speaking, gaming and hospitality are fairly related. A lot of similarities in scope. But after 10 years, you either stay in Indian country or you stay in that gaming vertical, or you want to expose yourself to different things. I wanted to expose myself into more of a traditional business environment after doing that for 10 years, even though my family maintained another 15-year relationship with the tribe. We have actually relatives that are tribal members today. But I was hired away, frankly, by a developer called Mark Harris, still a friend, one of my mentors, frankly, who was the first developer of AmeriSuites. So he conceptualized AmeriSuites, joined them as a VP of operations. He saw in me some guy with a strange resume, but creative, if you will. And I did that for a few years based out of Austin, Texas. We sold the concept to Prime. Prime then grew AmeriSuites. AmeriSuites was then sold to Hyatt, and that's Hyatt Place. So it was a long journey, if you will, that just got rebranded over time. But the basic concept really started with this developer called Mark Harris. I was recruited away by Archie and Monty Bennett at Remington to give you some perspective. And again, what interested them was somebody that was very entrepreneurial in nature and had really done a lot of lateral things in the industry versus the traditional hotel vertical. And it was hard to be their SVP of sales and marketing of all things, even though that was not necessarily a role that I'd had in my career previously that defined. We had, and back then they were acquiring the RTC portfolios, and some of that was with some cash being lent by or provided by Henry Silverman and what was then HFS in those days. And so out of the 70 or so hotels that Remington managed, then probably 50 of them or 45% were HFS franchises. So I had a lot of interaction, as you might imagine, with the team at in Parsippany on the HFS side before the company became Sendit. A little known fact, but the guy that ran the hotel division back in those days, if you remember, was Eric Pfeffer. I hired Eric Pfeffer as a desk clerk many years earlier in Miami. We had just remained friends all those years. And so when an opportunity developed, he actually recommended me for a particular role. And I joined what was then HFS, which then became Sendit. That over time developed into the president of the Wingate Inns brand, and that was kind of my reintroduction back into traditional branding and to some extent hotel operations. Became the CMO of the hotel division at Sendit back in those days, and then eventually went over to RCI, primarily because I wanted a lot more international exposure. Remember the domestic. The hotel division back in those days was primarily domestic with a few master licensees, not really a lot of international exposure, maybe Canada being the one big exception. And RCI, on the other hand, provided me a lot of platform. I already spoke Spanish, I already spoke Portuguese, so I had a lot of flexibility in terms of how to grow. Ken May, who was another mentor of mine, thinking of from that standpoint, gave me an opportunity, saw something that kind of made sense from an exchange standpoint, and that's what I did for the next, frankly, 7 or 8 years at Sendit, maybe longer, which is really kind of growing all the way up to running the EMA portfolio based out of London. Going back to 2008, 2008 was a good thing and a bad thing, which is, I like to put it, you never wanted to be a middle senior manager in 2008, right? And so while I survived and maybe originated some of the restructures in a Sendit environment, this one I did not. And the reality is I was kind of competing for the CEO's job at RCI. I did not get it. You never want to be the number 2, maybe the 3, number 4. But so anyway, it wasn't long thereafter that I had an opportunity. And I had to make a decision that I want to stay international, frankly. And I had a lot of exposure in China. I used to live in Beijing internationally as well. I used to live in Mexico City. Or did I want to come back to the States? Frankly, it was a personal decision. Ultimately, my daughter, who was not with me during much of this international career, I felt that I really needed to be a little closer to home. She was an adult at that stage of the game, but there was a personal obligation. And so I moved back to the States, and the opportunity developed with Club Quarters, where I'm still at. So I've been here since 2000, really beginning of 2009, which was an interesting time to start as a CEO of a hotel company, as you might imagine. It was not exactly the best year in the industry, and I've been here straight through. So at this stage, this is kind of, as I like to put it, my last hurrah. I'm not looking for a career beyond this one, other than doing a good job in the one that I'm in now. And that's kind of the career trajectory. The only point that I'll make was what's interesting is when I kind of think back at what prepared me for the transitions that I made, whether they be international, whether they be from hotel division to RCI, whether they be from Indian gaming back in the hotel industry, much of that was strategic. And I just looked at where did I have a competitive advantage, maybe a little bit more lateral thinking than the typical hotelier that's very vertical in their thinking, right? And whether it's on the development side, whether the operations side, or the branding side, and where did I have some skill sets that were language and both cultural, where I had a great sense of the culture, but I still really got public U.S. companies, or I got private companies, and had I worked for entrepreneurs that were, and there's the good and the bad about entrepreneurs, right? As I like to put it, right, with a very clear vision. But was I comfortable in working in those environments, and would I have enough space to continue to create, motivate, grow myself? And so every step of the way, I would kind of leverage bits and pieces of that broader background. And ultimately, that made me more successful in this business, I think, than it would have been if I'd come up the traditional hospitality vertical. It gave me just a different set of eyes, a different way of looking at the same problem or opportunity. And what you begin convinced of when you work and live a lot internationally is that there's plenty of ways of skinning a cat. Not one system is the only system, not one way is the only way. And it's the same in business, frankly. There's usually more ways to grow and more ways to adapt and more ways to solve a problem than just one way. And it's been very helpful for me throughout my whole career.
Well, John Paul, I've known you a long time, and I have to say, your career is even more impressive than what I knew. And I do agree with you about just the cultural diversity of the experiences that you were able to bring into leadership roles. And then just the breadth of working across the category in the way that you did really does give you a perspective and a way of helping people solve non traditional problems. So, one, congratulations on such a remarkable career. I know that you're placed often in very challenging environments and had to produce results. And I saw it when you took on Wingate because that was a new brand, obviously, that had to be built from the ground up. But I certainly think all of those kinds of challenging roles that you had throughout your career really powered it in very exceptional ways. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about Club Quarters, because I'm not sure our audience would be totally
Sure.
familiar with them, and what your role is like today as the CEO of this business.
Club Quarters been around since 1993, so it's a lot older company than most people perceive. So that's a long-term play in the hotel business with the same brand as you think. It's been independent for all of its life. It was developed by a high net worth family, who still is the Bonner family. The entrepreneur is a guy called Ralph Bonner, who's since passed. He was also one of the co-founders of Priceline. So just think of him as a serial entrepreneur, but at a very high level. The basic concept was originally 1993. It was hard to believe, but hardly any select service hotels in New York City or any major
Oh,
urban area, right? And so the real premise was a select service hotel to solve the problem of how could you get a reasonably priced room in New York City that wasn't the big boxes, the Hilton, the Sheraton, whatever that may be, because most corporates could not find that, right? So that's how the original hotel started in 1993. I'll come back to the business model in a second. And what made it interesting, and still makes it interesting, though today it's much more of a traditional hotel model than it was back then, is all of the marketing was B2B marketing. There was no B2C marketing whatsoever. It was never intended to grow the brand as a B2C brand. It was intended to, we called directly in JP Morgan. We'd effectively get them to commit to a block of rooms. And depending on the size of the block of rooms, you had a certain rate profile. And that's all we did. No OTA business. Effectively, the weekends were empty almost, but it was a very, very profitable environment. Obviously, things have changed in New York City. Right now, you probably got 500 select service hotels in New York City. And so that business model has adapted and changed over time. But it's a vertically integrated company. We build what we operate, what we manage, what we brand. We've sold a few hotels over the years. The building company or the ownership company is the vehicle for the Bonner family. It's a company called Masterworks. But we manage all of Masterworks assets, if you will. And a few hotels were sold to Blackstone. A few hotels were sold to an insurance company in France. But generally speaking, most are still owned by the parent. It's a company that's very comfortable developing in real estate. So we're kind of a developer-centric brand today. We are looking and considering growing into third-party management, which we have not historically done. And just as a way of kind of amortizing centralized costs, and frankly, and not always having to put up all the equity ourselves. To date, we've been the sole source of equity. You're only going to grow at such a pace if you're going to be the sole source of equity versus putting up 20% of the equity, being a general partner and being able to grow on a more accelerated basis. So we are looking for ways to grow a little faster now, but we're conservative in our nature. The other thing was we're very, very particular in terms of the markets that we're in. The reason we have not today, you never say never, we have not franchised with anybody else and don't plan on doing so in the near future, is that our real estate is excellent in every market that we're in. And so I think instead of having to pay a franchise brand, we effectively pay a lot of money for the real estate in the first place, or for the land in the first place. And the quality of that location in these urban markets generally don't require a franchise to support that. And the business model was able to support that. Obviously, things change. You always look at things, and who knows what that model is going to look like 15 years from now. And the big change, frankly, is distribution, as we know, in the industry is totally different now than it was 10 years ago, than it was 20 years ago, than it was 30 years ago. It's going to be totally different 10 years from now. And that, more than anything else, causes change in business models, much less so real estate changes and things of that nature. So So today we are, we're high margin, profitable businesses. Never used any really third party branding. Never used any third party managers. So truly kind of a one story fits all. We are in the process of kind of tiering some of our hotels and tiering future development, where we've got what I call a quiet luxury kind of product at Bryant Park right now that's been very successful. We've got a couple of projects under development very similar to that. That's obviously, not a Dorchester as I quality, but an Andaz quality luxury product from that standpoint. We have a series of hotels that we are looking to maybe convert to Webster, which is a in-house a lifestyle brand. They're just the bones of those hotels, and the particular location would make sense. Then obviously we have traditional club quarters, which continue to produce, and we're looking at developing those as well. Different pieces of land, different pieces of dirt, different locations lend themselves better to any one of those three. So we don't just have one brand that we're trying to grow going forward.
Well, thank you for that, John Paul. And I do think understanding sort of that developer-led mindset and the real estate part of the business is important for everyone to understand, because I still think regardless of what segment people work in the industry, understanding how those pieces come together is really important.
It also drives how you think as a company. I don't think I've asked once, what's our fee income? It's just not relevant. What matters to me is what's our EBITDA. And that's true in every asset. And that's true whether we manage it for our own account, meaning that it's owned by us, or whether it's for a third party because we sold it to them. It's the same basic premise. In the end, we know that what makes an owner happy isn't the fees they pay me, it's the EBITDA that we deliver to the owner, regardless of the owner. So the company's very focused on that. And it's just the nature of our DNA in the fact that we still own the majority of the hotels. It's just it's built in, right? So we don't treat one versus the other. And our lesson learned is that this goes back to the whole old company-owned store, model, which is you always want to favor the hotel you don't own versus the hotel you do own. That's the only way I know to make sure that third-party owners are happy versus if you happen to own hotels in the same city, especially, right? Mm-hmm. And that's very much in our DNA as well. So,
yeah, well, very, very good advice. I know you talked a lot about sort of the cultural evolution in terms of your career, but I'm wondering if you can speak about when you're approaching a new market or you're faced with a very difficult business challenge, how do you approach problem solving, and has that approach changed over the years as your experience has grown?
I'll kind of answer from a market standpoint, because problem solving and market, they may be related, but they can be very different. Certainly from a market standpoint, we're strong believers in data. We're strong believers in history, and we're strong believers in doing some good research in terms of changes that you anticipate in the market, whether they be real estate oriented industries. Those can be positives and negatives, right? Because if you're a developer and you're heavily invested in real estate, it's a long-term play. It's not a 1 or 2 year play. So you need to have a little sense of continuity. While we certainly analyze every business on a 5-year basis, we've only sold, we only sold some hotels in 2006, some hotels in 2016. We don't sell very often. It's kind of what I'm getting at. So we're long-term holders, generally speaking. But we want to make sure that financially there's a good enough return prior to an investment, obviously. So 1, data. 2, return. 3, how do you differentiate yourself with a customer base? Because a commodity product today is going to average like everybody else in the market. So if you want to outperform, you either have to niche yourself, which we've always tried to do with a business customer approach historically, or if you're going to be a lifestyle hotel, you got to approach yourself with a particular consumer, a little more experiential. And so, because if you don't have a point of difference in this business, you're going to average like everybody else does. And there's no real premium return versus somebody else. Nor can you really, I think, drive results or expect to drive results that are different than everybody else. In other words, doing 100% market share is not a win. 110% market share is a win, so to speak, is what I'm getting. The extra 10% is usually a differentiated product, a better location, and at times better management, right? So the other thing I think that certainly, I think the quality of the teams, whether you're on the development side or you're whether on the problem solving side, and I come back to that, is critical. Talent solves issues. brains, your team solves issues. And so the quality of the people you surround yourself with, and especially complementary people, not people just like you, but in fact, that end up making the whole, better than the sum of the parts, so to speak, I think is the difference between the great companies. And I aspire to be a great company. I'm not going to take credit for that yet, but my point that is, I think, the difference between those and the ones that are average, right? And which brings me all the way back to problem solving. Now, first of all, you got to look at problem solving as an opportunity, right? Some people look at problem solving to create stress. I don't. I love challenges. That's what motivates me at this business. I like the fact that our customers are all different. I like the fact that our markets are all different. And that's what makes it stimulating for me. I like the cultures that are different. And that's a motivator. And if you're motivated, that's number one in terms of problem solving. Number two, surround yourself with the same comment I made. Smart people find opportunities. Smart people solve problems. Don't assume your answer is the right answer. That's usually the wrong answer more often than not, right? Delegate well to that talent, but don't abdicate. There is a difference between, the trust is earned, so to speak, but you have to be willing to let people earn it, right? You can't over control, otherwise you lose the very talent that I'm talking about. And last but not least, I go back to the comment about make sure that whatever your solution is the most cost-effective one. And I say that because in the end, cost matters, right? And I don't mean cheap, but we have a process that we say club quarterizing. Some people might say that means finding cheap solutions. No, it's the opposite. We just try to find the most efficient and effective way of delivering, whether it's a revenue management issue, whether it's a development issue, whether it's an employee issue. And how do you staff appropriately? Kiosks is a good example. Kiosks and Wingate in club quarters just coincidentally introduced kiosks in the same year. I'm talking about 20 some odd years ago, right? Today they're everywhere, right? But the premise was about how do we provide better service but cut costs? It was engineered. So really being able to kind of break a problem or a solution in its parts and then look at its parts and then cobble it back together in a way the consumer or the employee, and if it's both of those and it's a home run, really see some value out of it, is the key to club quarters. And frankly, it's the key to, I think, to a good business methodology, and really is foundational almost with everything we do here.
Well, I think you've offered a lot of very impactful wisdom. I wrote down a lot of things that you had said, John Paul, but I do think that element of talent, I think we're all on a quest today to find good talent. I think it's a challenge in terms of surrounding ourselves and really driving the growth of those individuals. I do love your statement about don't abdicate, but delegate, because I do think that's really important from a leader's point of view to make sure you drive the accountability. But what I really loved was that whole element of the efficiency mindset and trying to find the most effective way to drive the right kind of commercial outcome. And I'm certain that is what has powered your career in the way it has in terms of the kind of value creation you could deliver to shareholders and real estate investors and the kind of stakeholders that you're working with today, because I do think that's really important for us because there are an awful lot of options out there, but us really thinking about how to get the best results at the most cost-effective way, I think is critically important. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about mentorship and people that might have influenced your journey, and if you could offer any thoughts in terms of how they shaped your leadership.
I did think you're kind enough to provide me with that question. I had to think about that because especially as you think through over 40 years, it's natural sometimes to gravitate to the last 5 years, right? But I wanted to start with my dad, and what my dad gave me, and obviously my mom was equally instructive, so I don't. But my dad taught me to risk. I'm not saying that dad always took the right risk. That's a different story. But he taught me that risk was okay. And that really is what drove a lot of my decisions to travel internationally or to try something different. Because if you don't try, you never experience. I can't say it any other way. In a way that was reasonably thoughtful. I mean, it's not willy-nilly, but that one element has served me my whole life, to be honest with you. And it's there was another guy early on who was an investor back in the early Indian days. Remember, before the bill, before the law was passed. This was the Wild West of business, I used to call it, right? But there's a guy called Al Perman, who was a drugstore owner in D.C. and was just an investor. So he taught me the elements of how to be an entrepreneur, and that was very, very important early on, because part of that, my work experience had been with Howard Johnson's parent company. I don't say that necessarily I was going to learn how to be an entrepreneur, right? So, because it was that entrepreneurship or that ability to bring that into every other career move thereafter, when I went back into the hotel or the broader hospitality industry, that was very useful. I mentioned Mark Harris, who was the guy that conceptualized and originally developed the Marriott Suites, because he taught me to not look at a resume based on, look, they have experience in hotels, but a resume can tell a lot of story about talent. And he saw in me somebody that was creative, a little bit of a risk taker, somebody who was successful in a variety of different environments. So I said, you know what? I'm sure he'll be successful with me. And it was a lesson that I've taken as I've considered others and other people that I've hired over the many, many years. And it gave me a chance. And ultimately, that was something I'm going to mention Eric Pfeffer, who we both know, because Eric, while, it just says two things. First of all, it's a small industry. Two, the relationships you formed 30 years earlier are going to be, they're still going to be there 30 years later, right? And so somebody that worked for me much, much younger eventually gave me another opportunity many, many years later within Ascendant itself, right? I'm going to mention a guy called Kirk Postmentor, who was very relational, but he taught me not all the elements. I'm certainly not perfect at this, but he taught me a lot about the polish necessary in a public company environment and how to deal with that level of skill set and that level of communication, which is not something I'd really had prior. So that's, again, something I've been able to mature and use many times over since then and recommunicate. And last but not least, I want to mention the two guys that in the company I'm in now. Ralph Vana, who's passed, as I mentioned, the entrepreneur that hired me here. He's certainly, the aspect of kind of really think about engineering a brand and really looking at a brand from scratch and differentiating was very much his mantra. And the person that frankly replaced Ralph, a guy called Bill Lovejoy, who runs Masterworks, the development company, who he and I really partner together. But he has really taught me a significant amount about financial acumen, what I'll call the development process over the years as we've built hotels here, especially in a club quarters environment, the funding and financing of such, the lending process, all of which were maybe not what the skill sets that I was learning in Ascendant environment, which is much more branding oriented, or in a prior operations environment, or certainly in the Indian gaming environment. That wasn't in the early stages. That wasn't it at all, right? So it's really different mentors helped me grow at different stages of my career. And you just learn different things from different folks. If you listen, the thing I love about this business and why I'm still working, to be honest with you, because my sense is neither you or I probably still need to work, is I'm having fun. And I have fun because I'm still learning every day. The day I'm doing the same old, it's the same job, and I've been doing this for whatever number of years, is the day I should retire. But today, I'm still motivated, and I really do learn everything every day because the industry changes, it morphs. The markets are different. I mean, Germany's different than England, and England's different. London's different than Manchester. You name it, right? So in developing in all those environments, how to be successful in all those environments, I'm using those as just proxies. All of that are learning experiences, right? And that's really the best part of the industry from my point.
Well, again, a lot in terms of what you offer to the audience. And I do think this thread of being a lifelong learner is what we see with a lot of highly successful people, John Paul, because it's you embrace every opportunity. But I do think as you talk about your career development and how your dad really gave you permission to take measured risks and really opened up those kinds of things, the thread of relationships and really understanding how they power careers throughout our life journey, the skill versus experience, which is a big conversation today as we start to look at talent, recognize not everybody has a lived experience, but perhaps the skills that they've acquired along the way can allow them to be successful in environments. That whole concept of entrepreneurship and really what that means, and then the polish, because I certainly agree with you in the public market environment. There is an expectation about how you represent yourself and how you represent your company. And then I do think about this last stage of your career where you've learned so much about the real estate business, the lending, the underwriting, and all of those kinds of pragmatic elements associated with the business. I mean, you've had a remarkable career. You have so much to share with so many of us. And I thank you for unpacking all of that learning journey and how some of these folks really helped you in terms of really driving some of your success. I'm wondering if we, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to make one comment, and this may be not the right place, but it's kind of thinking through. It's always important, I think, sometimes to look back and say, what would I have done differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing I definitely would have done differently, knowing what I value today, maybe what I didn't value enough then, is my work-life balance today is much better than it used to be. And so ambition's a very good thing, but too much ambition has a downside, right? And so as I work with people today, including very ambitious executives, my message to them is there's a lot of good to learn by being but it's also much more important to make sure your family is equally important, your spouse, your whatever, your partner, whatever is equally important, right? And because in the end, you're not going to take your job at the end. You're going to take the rest of it with you, your family, etc. So if I were to do something a little differently, and I wouldn't necessarily have been any less successful if I did this differently, what I would have taken better time to better balance some of the constituencies that I had, and it was really more the personal constituencies that I should have better balanced. And yeah. I say that to any young, ambitious man or woman today, frankly, because it's a long career, but you got one family, right? And so that family, in the end, is probably the most important one, either the one you came from or the one you're going to create. Either one are important, right? So anyway, that's just I do think about that periodically, and certainly looking at your daughter, who's now 40 years old, right, if you will. Once in a while, she's very good at reminding me of that, which is great. That's what somebody that's sometimes successful or ambitious needs, right? Because it's important that we don't believe our own stories, but because in the end, everybody is part of your story. So
yeah, no, I think that's really well said, and I think that's a very important message today, because I think as that employer-employee balance is continuing to shift, I think people protecting their mental well-being and their health is an important consideration. That's all part of how I think we bring great leadership to the workplace too, John Paul. I'm just wondering, you are such a polished speaker. I just love listening to you because you're so eloquent. I'm just wondering if you can share with our audience how you prepare to deliver your messages so powerfully.
First of all, experience helps. I've got a little gray hair, right? So, believe it or not, I'm actually pretty shy. And so I realized early on that I had to develop certain skill sets. So one, I actually practiced. I know it's hard to believe, but you have to practice public speaking. You have to expose yourself. You have to sit up and speak in front of 2,000 people. And even scared as you may be, and that first time is going to be not as good as the last time, right? But practice does make perfect. So there is an element of that. Two, the more preparation you do on a subject matter, and obviously I'm pretty prepared when it comes to talking about myself. That's one thing. But whatever the subject matter is, right? It could be markets, it could be opportunities, it could be where to develop, it could be how to grow as a human being, whatever your culture is. So preparation, and the more you prepare and practice, the better you're going to be able to deliver that message. Last but not least, I think it's very, very important to whatever you're saying that you actually believe in it. Because if you believe in it, you're going to be authentic and deliver. Everybody's going to have a different style, right? But the authenticity comes from in your core, you believe the message that you're delivering, right? And I tend to very much do that, as opposed to deliver messages that I don't believe in. Because there's a time and a place to do that, but I'd rather have somebody else deliver that message. They're going to be more authentic than I am, if that makes a difference. So I think that's part of it. Now, it's interesting. I was gave me an opportunity once to go to a kind of a senior executive training environment. And one of the things they did was film, something like this, and they showed you how you reacted. And the whole idea was to see how you presented and how believable were you? And the lesson that I learned, and I was very polished, and I had my nice suit on. I looked very corporate, but I was too polished. And what came across to me when I looked at it as a kind of an observer now, but more importantly to the audience, which were the peers that were participating in the same conference or training conference, is that it goes back to that word authenticity, which I know is overused a little bit, but too much of a polish causes you also to lose credibility. It was a funny comment, and so to me, that preparation needs to be, how can I say this? It needs to be to a point that you're not, I'll never read from slides. I just don't. I'll have a few slides up there, but it's always to be able to speak to the subject matter that the slide's outlining, because it's not the slide, it's you that people are buying into. It's whatever you're saying that people are buying into, right? If it was just a slide, I could just email the slide to everybody else. And so the lesson learned was don't over practice and just be knowledgeable. And if you're knowledgeable, be comfortable in your own set, and you're going to be able to answer whatever questions come your way. Or last but not least, the other thing I learned is if you don't know the answer, just say you don't know the answer and you'll get back to somebody. It's as simple as that.
Well, again, I think that is very sage and thoughtful elements to leave with our audience, because I've always believed, like you, John Paul, that practice and putting the time in to, really cultivate your thoughts in advance. But I do think that element of being true to yourself and making sure that the message that you're delivering is a very credible one, because it's something you believe in, is an important thing for us all to keep in mind. We're coming up near the end of the interview, John Paul, and you've offered so much to the audience. And I know you spoke about if you were to go back and give yourself some younger advice. But I'm just wondering, based on the kind of career that you've had, if we were thinking about some of the emerging leaders that listen to this podcast or webcast, if there's anything else that you would offer to them personally or professionally that might resonate with them as they're starting their career or early in their career.
I'll make two comments. One is it's a long career, so don't assume that you know what you know and that you're going to be comfortable with that. So expose, if you may like the industry, which is fine, you don't necessarily get brought up, but expose yourself to different aspects of the industry. First of all, you're going to learn something along the way. You're going to find out that maybe you like doing left instead of doing right. But more importantly, you're going to learn to respect everybody else in the industry, because every part of the industry is critical for us to be successful as a whole. I don't care if it's a floor attendant all the way to the banker that's lending you the money. One without the other doesn't work. It's as simple as that. So that's one. I think international exposure in today's environment, maybe not as much as I was, is pretty critical. Most large hotel companies, and hotel companies are getting larger, distribution companies are getting larger, not smaller, all have significant global components. The industry is a much smaller industry than you think from a global standpoint. So allowing yourself, especially early on, which is where the time you want to get international exposure, will help your career. A lot of people get nervous about that, thinking I'm going to be out of the limelight. But realistically, you're not likely to become a very senior executive unless in today's environment, you've also had some international exposure as well as some domestic exposure. That's two. Number three, and I was never promoted because I did my day job, not once. It was always because I raised my hand and said, I want to participate in that project. So raising your hand and being willing to do something different, first of all, it's a learning experience. But number two, that's when you're going to get noticed. You're going to get noticed because you did something outside the norm, not the norm. And so it's being willing to do that. Again, take a risk. Go back to that comment, right? That served me my whole life because that's how I got noticed. Because if you're not noticed, it's a real risk. Listen, that's a potential challenge with kind of the Zoom culture we have now, especially if you're younger and you haven't gotten noticed yet. It's harder to get noticed in that environment than if you're working in a team environment. You just kind of stand out to the senior executive that you're presenting to as part of a team, whatever that may be, right? But those really are what I would say to any young manager, or somebody kind of joining the industry as they kind of go for it. Last but not least, I know this, most everybody says this, but not everybody is going to be. Not everybody wants to be the CEO, even if they could be the CEO. there's every component part of our business is valuable. If you want to be a floor attendant, just be the best floor attendant. If you want to be a bellman, be the best bellman. If you want to be a CEO, be the best CEO. It's about taking pride in the particular thing you're doing. In us, frankly, taking pride in the people that are doing it. So,
yeah. Well, again, I think just the human quality of your leadership there, John Paul, and recognizing, the breadth of talent that is part of our industry, and then giving people that advice in terms of making some of those risks, taking those risks and making those investments early in their career will pay dividends later in their career. I think it's extraordinarily well said. And I just would like to thank you for offering so much to our audience today. I think you've given everybody some very thoughtful considerations as they work through their career. And if I may, I would like to just remind everyone and thank them, that if you've enjoyed this episode listening to John Paul and all of his wisdom, I hope you come and visit us at itspersonalstories.com for more wisdom from hospitality leaders across the globe. So I hope to see you there. John Paul, thank you again for being such an important part of our show today.
Dorothy, thank you. I enjoyed it, and I'm happy to do this again. And listen, I look forward to seeing NYU. So I'll send you a separate email. I hope it will find some time.
Thank you.
Thank you.